Boa tarde. Então, gostaria de apresentar a professora Geetha Balakrishnan, da Universidade de Warwick. Ela
Então, boa tarde. É um prazer receber a professora Geetha Balakrishnan, da Universidade de Warwick, no Reino Unido. Ela é uma colaboradora aqui do CBPF já há um bom tempo, e ela é especialista na síntese de monocristais pelo método de fluxo metálico, de floating zone, de imagem. E ela vai estar aqui por umas 2 semanas e hoje vai apresentar esse colóquio intitulado Magnetic Skyrmion Materials. So, thank you, Geetha.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. So, thanks very much for this kind invitation to come and give a talk here, and thanks to all of you for attending and staying back for this talk. This is my 3rd visit to the CBPF, and I've always enjoyed coming here and working with my collaborators here. So thanks again for this kind invitation and for the funding to visit Rio once again. So I'm going to be telling you something about magnetic skyrmion materials, which is part of which will describe part of the work done in my lab on just one project. We are a small outfit, but we have a lot of interest in a wide variety of materials. And I'll just give you an overview of some of the work that we are doing on skyrmion materials. So to start with, I'd like to show you where I am from. The University of Warwick, for those of you who don't know, is actually in the edge of the city of Coventry. So if you want to come to the University of Warwick, please don't go to Warwick because it's a long trip from Warwick. So we are just in the outskirts of the city of Coventry, and we are about 100 miles from London. And we are very close to Shakespeare's birthplace, Stratford-upon-Avon. And Warwick itself is about 8 to 10 miles away. And there's a beautiful medieval castle in Warwick, if you want to visit and have a look at it. So it's in the center of England, and it's located in quite a historic part of the country. So the plan of the talk today is to give you a brief introduction to skyrmion materials. I'll describe the different materials and the crystals that we've grown and investigated in this class. And time permitting, I'll also tell you about a few of the new and ongoing projects that we have. So, as I said, one of the projects that I participate in is on the skyrmion materials. And this is funded by the UK funding agency, EPSRC. And we are just one of 5 universities who've got funding for this research in a national project. So it's quite a large project. There's myself and my colleague Martin Lees at Warwick, and these are all the principal investigators from the other universities which are participating in this project, from University of Durham, Oxford, Cambridge, and Southampton as well. So at Warwick, we are charged with the key challenge in materials. So I had the key challenge in producing materials of these skyrmion magnetic materials, the crystals, I mean, single crystals as well as polycrystalline material of these this class of materials. And we also characterize these skyrmion materials using a whole range of techniques at Warwick. And then, of course, there's a lot of collaborative effort with the rest of the partners. So I'll be presenting some of the work done by my past student, Sam Holt, and my past postdoc, Aleš Stefancic, and my current students, Emilia Hall and George Wood. And there's also the postdoc, Tom Chamberlain. We are supported by Daniel Mayo, who's our research fellow, and my colleagues, Martin Lees and Oleg Petrenko. So that's the team that's worked on this project so far. So for the purpose of this talk, I think as far as what skyrmions are, all you need to know is that these are topologically stable magnetic whirls that are brought about because of the interaction, competition between two different interactions, one of which is the short-range exchange, which, as you know, favors the parallel or the anti-parallel arrangement, which is ferromagnetic or antiferromagnetic, could be ferrimagnetic as well. And then there is the other interaction, which is the relativistic spin-orbit coupling, which is present in materials which lack an inversion symmetry. And this is called the DM interaction, Dzerzhinsky-Moria interaction. So a competition between these two, one of which tends to favor the parallel or the anti-parallel, and then this antisymmetric, the super exchange, gives rise to these structures here, which are actually spin textures, and they are chiral, topologically stable. And if you think of them as a hedgehog and a flattened hedgehog, you see that the spins can be arranged in this sort of fashion. Now, these can vary as well in geometry, and I'll tell you a little bit more about those. So the first skyrmion materials that were discovered were manganese silicide, and closely followed by the iron germanium and the copper oxyselenate. Now, if you look at these most well-studied of the skyrmion materials, one thing that you will see that's common between all of them is that they're all chiral space groups, and this gallium vanadium 4 sulfurate is a polar space group. And they all, most of them in the beginning tended to adopt the B20 or the P213 crystal symmetry. So there was a lot of search going on for new skyrmion materials in this specific symmetry or space group. And then it was followed by the discovery of these two materials. Of course, the cobalt, zinc, manganese, again, is a chiral space group, and this is a polar space group. So the skyrmions that I told you about can stabilize in several different forms of spin arrangement. The spin textures, the way they are arranged can be different, and they are classified as block skyrmions, nail skyrmions, and also anti-skyrmions. And if you see the pictorial depiction of how they are organized, the spins, in the nail skyrmions, they are coming out from the center, and for the block skyrmions, they are going into the center. And then for the anti-skyrmions, you have half of each of these. So that's about all you need to know, really. But I'll go on to tell you a little bit more about what the actual skyrmion pocket is in these materials. So it's not like antiferromagnetism or ferromagnetism, where you see that below a particular temperature, you have all the spins ordered in a particular way, and you see them. So these skyrmions are seen only in a narrow pocket in the HT phase diagram. So for instance, for manganese silicide or copper oxyselenate, if you remember from the previous slide, these were some of the most well-studied materials. You find that they define a phase called the A phase here in the HT phase diagram, and this is where the skyrmions are present. So they are seen in a very narrow HT region in the HT phase diagram. So you're looking for this exotic spin arrangement in these narrow pockets in the HT phase diagram. So I want to tell you about 3 different types of materials as examples of these skyrmion textures. And one of them is the magnetic spinels that I listed in the earlier slides, which is gallium vanadium 4 sulfurate and the gallium vanadium 4 seleniumate. And then I'll go on to give you a few examples in layered and 2D magnets. And then lastly, some of these intermetallic frustrated magnets as well, which have been discovered quite recently. So of the first class, we look at these magnetic spinels, and this formed the thesis topic of Sam Holt's thesis, and Aleš Stefancic, my previous postdoc, worked on this quite a lot. So what are these materials? Now, these are spinel materials, and they are called lacuna spinels because you have every other, in the unit cell, every other formula unit has a gallium vacancy in it, and they are called lacunar spinels. Now, both gallium vanadium 4 sulfurate and gallium vanadium 4 seleniumate are isostructural. They adopt the same structure at room temperature. It's a non-centrosymmetric cubic F4-3M structure. They both undergo the same structural transition from cubic to rhombohedral at low temperatures. They also undergo the same magnetic transition to the ferromagnetic state. And from a chemistry point of view, they are very similar in the electronic configuration as well. Now, I've plotted the HT phase diagram taken from literature. These are very well studied. And you see here the skyrmion lattice, the skyrmion pocket is very easily identified in these materials. And here again, they are in a certain range in the HT phase diagram. So what we wanted to see was, since we have the gallium vanadium 4 sulfurate and the seleniumate, both known to exhibit skyrmions, is it possible to go all the way from gallium vanadium 4 sulfurate to the seleniumate by gradually substituting at either the sulfur site or the selenium site, and therefore create a whole range of skyrmion exhibiting materials? So is that possible? So the first thing to do then is to study the parent materials to start with. So if we take the parent material, gallium vanadium 4 sulfurate and the seleniumate, and you look at the structural transition that takes place, the sulfurate undergoes a structural transition at 42 Kelvin, and the seleniumate material undergoes a structural transition at 41 Kelvin. So they're very, very close to each other. What happens exactly at this structural transition? Now, in this structure, you look at them as being made up of two different types of structural units. One of them being the vanadium 4 sulfur 4 heterocubane, and the other being the gallium vanadium 4 tetrahedra. So all the distortion that takes place as a result of the structural transition resides within these two units. So this is the vanadium 4 sulfur 4 heterocubane, and you see the bond distances marked above the transition and below the transition, and you see the distortion in them. And we were actually able to follow it as a function of temperature by doing powder neutron diffraction at the ILL in Grenoble in France. And we've also done single crystal X-ray and single crystal neutron diffraction using the SXD instrument in ICIS at the spallation source in the UK. So if you follow the powder diffraction as a function of temperature, you see that at 50 K, which is above the structural transition, if you follow the 448 peak, for example, it's a single peak. And if you go down in temperature, you find the splitting very, very clearly. So we can exactly pinpoint where the structural transition takes place, and also follow the distortions that happen between the structural units here. Okay. It's taking a while to register the transition. Thank you. Yes. So the best way to study these materials, or any materials for that matter, is to get high quality single crystals. Okay. So what we did was we produced single crystals of the entire range of materials at integer substitution steps. And these single crystals are grown by the chemical vapor transport technique. So we just start off with the material, use a transporting agent such as iodine, and produce crystals. And these have been very well characterized with the X-ray, single crystal X-ray diffraction. So we know the exact composition of all of these, and they're very close to the starting composition. So what we looked at was the to look for the structural transition, because its structural transition is very key to the magnetic transition as well. So there's a strong link between the structural properties and the magnetic properties in this material. So remember, we need a non-centrosymmetric space group where you have the Dzieluzinski-Moriya interaction to give rise to the antisymmetric spin-orbit coupling, and therefore result in the formation of the skyrmions. So the first thing to look for is a structural transition in all of these intermediate compounds. And we did not find a structural transition in any of these materials, except those very, very close to the end compounds. So what we then did was to look at compositions very close to the end materials. Okay, so very close to the selenium-8 and the sulfur-8, not in such a large step, but in very, very small steps. And what we find is, I'm sorry, there's a delay between me pressing this and the picture actually showing up. So we are also able to characterize the gallium vanadium 4 tetrahedra that I spoke about. And we actually know for all of these materials where the selenium sits and where the sulfur sits as we go from one end to the other. And we find that there's a preferential occupation of the sulfur to the vanadium 4 cluster and the selenium which sits around the gallium. So we know we can pinpoint exactly where all these atoms sit. So when we look at the structural transition at compositions very close to the end compounds, which I've plotted here in very, very minute steps here, very carefully synthesized powder materials, we find that the structural transition exists only for phases very close to the two end phases, but not for any of the intermediate phases. You see a very broadened sort of transition, and the temperature of the phase transition is strongly suppressed as you add more substituents in it. Another way of characterizing these is also to study the magnetic properties. So you can see what happens as a function of, okay. So if you look at the magnetic properties here, this is magnetic susceptibility as a function of temperature. Once again, you see that for compositions very close to the end materials, a different behavior to those quite far away from the end materials. One way of looking at these skyrmion pockets is to look at the dynamics of the susceptibility. So we do AC susceptibility measurements as a function of both field and temperature. So this is a very laborious measurement where you've got to stabilize at one particular temperature and scan the magnetic field, and then move slightly to another temperature and scan the magnetic field again, or the reverse. So you can build up a HT phase diagram. And if you look at the parent compounds here for y = 0 and y = 8, you know exactly where the skyrmion pockets are. And if you look at the end materials where I said there is a possibility of observing skyrmions, and indeed we do see some evidence very similar to what you see in the end compounds, but at a very, very low scale. So you see some evidence of some change in dynamics there, which would correspond to the dynamics which are very similar to the presence of skyrmion lattices. So we conclude that you need to substitute, if you substitute larger than 2.5% of the substituent, you just kill the phase transition that takes place, and therefore kill the skyrmion phase in these materials. So this was just to show how structure is very strongly linked to the magnetic properties in these materials. So the second class of materials that I want to talk to you about are the layered 2D magnets. Now, there's been a lot of interest in the layered 2D materials, and especially in the magnets, because as you know, since the discovery of graphene, there's been a lot of interest in layered materials per se, but especially in magnetic materials, because they are very useful for forming heterojunctions with other materials, and therefore new and exotic properties can be discovered in these heterojunctions. So I'm going to talk to you about two different types of magnetic materials. I'll briefly touch upon this material here, which I'll call FGT for short, and then the intercalated transition metal dichalcogenides, okay? So what's interesting about these materials? So let's take the FGT first. Now, there was a lot of excitement when this was proposed as a 2D van der Waals material. So these are the so-called van der Waals materials where the bonding between the layers in these layered materials is very weak, and hence they are very easily cleavable. The interesting thing about this structure is that it's a ferromagnetic metal, and the TC is around 220K. Now, I've been very modest in saying it's 220K, but you will see reports where they quote the TC as being much higher. Now, this is drastically high for a layered 2D material. I don't think there's any other material with such a high TC as a 2D van der Waals magnet. And what was more exciting was that there was some evidence of the observation of skyrmion-like structures, and they called them skyrmion bubbles. And this was observed by a group in the US associated with IBM, and they did what's called Lorentz transmission electron microscopy. So for those of you who are not familiar, this is a technique that's used to actually image these skyrmion lattices in these materials. So the skyrmions actually form a lattice which is very similar to you. By analogy, you can compare these with the vortices in a type 2 superconductor, for example. So you can also use small angle neutron scattering to study this lattice of skyrmions. And the Lorentz transmission electron microscopy, where you apply a magnetic field and you just change the focus, and you need to be a real expert to be able to extract this information from these materials. They are able to image these skyrmions in very thin lamellae of the materials. So this was imaged in the FGT material at 93 Kelvin in a field of about 600 oersteds, but they also claimed that you can remove the field after you stabilize these skyrmions and warm up the material, and the skyrmion lattice are still stabilized in this, okay? So there's a lot of interest. But what you will find, contrary to what I've said so far, is that this is not a non-centrosymmetric structure. This is a centrosymmetric space group. So you might ask, why? How is the skyrmion lattice stabilized here without the all-important Zhelezhinsky-Moria interaction that I said was important? Okay, so that's not still very well understood. There are a lot of theories proposing what might lead to this formation of the skyrmions, and one of them proposed in this material is that there is a competition between the uniaxial magnetic anisotropy and the magnetic dipole-dipole interaction in this. So there's a lot of debate about how these are stabilized. So let's look at this structure again. So in this structure, in the FGT structure, there are two different types of ion sites. They are called the ion 1 and the ion 2 sites in the crystal structure. And they crystallize in the centrosymmetric hexagonal space group. Now, it so happens that in this structure, there are a lot of ion vacancies. And because there are a lot of ion vacancies, it's very difficult to achieve the optimum TC in these materials. So you need to have this ion 2 site, which is the 2C site in the Wyckoff position in these. It has to be fully occupied to give you a stoichiometry of ion 3 in these materials. And only if you hit that ion 3 stoichiometry can you get the highest TC, okay? So how do you achieve that? Now you can grow single crystals again by the chemical vapor transport that I spoke to you about earlier, where you use a transport agent and you get these crystals. So these are all plate-like crystals that form quite nicely, okay? So what we have done is that we have actually determined what composition of iron, germanium, and tellurium you need to start with for these crystal growths in order to get the optimum TC. And if you look at this, you'll see that we are even able to control the actual ion content in the materials and therefore obtain a range of crystals with varying ion content. So you have varying TCs, okay? So you find that the TC can go up to about 230 easily, but a lot of people quote this as the TC where the transition is fully complete. So you've got to take all this with a pinch of salt. So where are the skyrmions in this material? If you plot the susceptibility as a function of temperature in these materials, you find that there is a kink in the susceptibility curve here at around 160. And this is where the skyrmion lattice is observed in these materials. So this is the region of interest that you're looking for, okay? So one further thing that you could do with this is again play with the lattice, and you can substitute the iron with cobalt because these there are a lot of ion vacancies, as I said, and it was previously proposed that you could do this to recover the antiferromagnetic state that was thought to exist before it went ferromagnetic. So here again, we've done a lot of crystal growth to obtain crystals with varying substitutions, cobalt substitutions in the FGT, and the TC is suppressed as you add cobalt, and you can get a lot of very nice crystals with very distinct cobalt substitution and look for this antiferromagnetic ordering, and that's in progress now. So the second class of the layered materials, if you remember, I said they were the layered TMDCs. So these are the transition metal dichalcogenides. Now they are called transition metal dichalcogenides because they are actually niobium, one of the transition metals, and selenium or sulfur, and they can also be other ones like molybdenum telluride, tantalum selenide, tungsten telluride. And for those of you who are young in the audience, these materials have been known for a long time, long before you were born. So these are not new materials at all. It's just that the techniques to probe these materials has become so sophisticated now. And also with the discovery of graphene, these materials have become really, really important for a lot of nice properties that they exhibit, okay? So each of these materials can stabilize in different polytypes. So you can, depending on the stacking of these materials, you can either have them in hexagonal form or a tetragonal form or some other cubic structures. And each of these polytypes will give you different physical properties, okay? So for example, molybdenum telluride in one form can be a superconductor and in another form can be a semiconductor. Tungsten telluride has been very well studied because it's known to be a wild semi-metal. Okay, so all of them have very interesting properties in their own right. Niobium selenide is a very well-known superconductor with a TC of 7.2 Kelvin, and they also all undergo charge density waves prior to the superconducting transition, and some of them undergo the charge density wave without really being superconducting. Okay, so they are all very interesting, and they are just a massive field on their own. So what we've done is we've had a look at these intercalated transition metal dichalcogenides. So what do you mean by intercalation? You know that I just said that they were van der Waals materials, they are layered materials, so there are all these big gaps between the layers where you can introduce a transition element or any element here and tune the properties of these materials. So what we have done here is, I'm just showing you a list of these TMDCs, each with an intercalant. Okay, so these, some of them are magnetic and some of them are non-magnetic. But what happens is you can stabilize a whole range of materials with differing magnetic orderings at different temperatures. So these are the very well-studied and well-known materials that I've listed here. And why are these interesting? Now, it's interesting to us because some of these exhibit what's called a magnetic soliton. So what's a magnetic soliton? A magnetic soliton is just regions of ferromagnetism which are separated by a 360 degrees domain wall by this helical arrangement of the spins. Okay, so these have been seen in chromium niobium sulfide and chromium tantalum sulfide, and these are seen as being very related to our skyrmion structures. Okay, so the interest here is that if we can understand the helimagnetism and the chiral state in these TMDCs, we can also understand the skyrmion structures that we see in some related materials. So these again are 2D materials. Like I said, you can intercalate them with, here vanadium sits at the intercalant position between the niobium sulfide layers here. They can be exfoliated and they are very, very easy to obtain as thin layered crystals. So for the chiral soliton lattice, we need a chiral helimagnetic ground state. Okay. And if you apply a field along perpendicular to the c-axis, in some of these materials like the chromium niobium sulfide, you see the formation of a chiral soliton lattice. And as you increase the field, you find these regions of the ferromagnetically aligned spins gradually increasing until finally they go into the forced ferromagnetic state. Okay, so this is the interest in these materials. So how do we observe these chiral soliton lattices? So once again, we produce nice crystals by the chemical vapor transport technique, once again using iodine as the transport agent. And we set ourselves 2 or 3 key questions. And this formed part of my student Emilia's thesis. And all the results have been published, so you can easily look them up. So the key questions was, what's the nature of the magnetic ordering in the vanadium niobium sulfide? Because there were conflicting reports in the literature. And then for the manganese third niobium sulfide, which for all practical purposes is very similar to the chromium third niobium sulfide, whether this exhibits a chiral soliton lattice or not. Okay, so that was the main focus of our investigation. But the very first step in this is to establish whether the crystals that we have produced crystallize in the non-centrosymmetric space group. Now, I've shown you all the information about the intercalated concentration of a third in these. So this is the magic critical composition at which there is a transition from the centrosymmetric to the non-centrosymmetric space group. And we need the non-centrosymmetric space group here in order to see the chiral soliton lattice and to see a helimagnetic ground state. So how do you establish whether it's centrosymmetric or non-centrosymmetric? The most straightforward method would be to do single crystal X-ray diffraction. But it turns out that it's not very clear from single crystal X-ray diffraction to distinguish between these 2 space groups, which are very, very closely aligned. So we use the TEM, the microscopy technique, to look at the electron diffraction in these. And you can tell by the relative intensities of the 030 and the 200 spots here to tell whether it's non-centrosymmetric or centrosymmetric. So ideally, we are aiming for a critical composition of a third here. And this has been established before we move on to actually study these materials. So taking a chromium third niobium sulfide, the TC is around 111 Kelvin. And how do you study the magnetic phase diagram in this? Once again, we do AC susceptibility measurements to look at the dynamics in the magnetic susceptibility and plot the HT phase diagram in these. So all these lines which are drawn as a guide to the eye are where there is a distinct change in the dynamics that you observe in the AC susceptibility. So we were able to clearly identify this as the helical state, the ground state. And then it goes to a state which is highly helical. And then it goes to another state which is highly ferromagnetic. And then it goes to the fully forced ferromagnetic state. Okay. So this is the imaginary part, and this is the real part of the susceptibility. Now, this is also supported by the Lorentz transmission electron microscopy that I told you about. And there, by doing measurements both at under focus and over focus regime, you can actually see the formation of the helices in very, very thin lamellae of these materials. So now going to the manganese third niobium sulfide, which I said for all practical purposes, very similar to the chromium third niobium sulfide. So the interest here is in seeing whether this exhibits a chiral soliton lattice, and if not, why not? Okay. So this has a TC of about 45 Kelvin. And if you compare the chromium niobium sulfide HT phase diagram with the manganese third niobium sulfide HT phase diagram, you see that they are quite different. You see several phases in the manganese third niobium sulfide from the dynamics, but you don't see this region, which is the helical ground state. And what we see is just the first ferromagnetic state. So what we've concluded just from these experiments, as well as from the LT, the Lorentz transmission electron microscopy, is that the manganese third niobium sulfide as the ground state just exhibits ferromagnetism, not helimagnetism. And although it's very, very similar to the chromium third niobium sulfide, the ground states are very different, okay? But since making these measurements, we've also had time to look at the manganese material with crystals and powder using neutron diffraction. And we find that there may be some interesting structural properties that may indicate some sort of modulation in the ferromagnetic structure. And if we were to look at slightly larger lamellae with the microscopy, we may be able to distinguish very clearly whether it's really a ferromagnetic state or a highly ferromagnetic chiral soliton lattice. Now, the next TMDC we looked at was the vanadium third. And here we did both neutron powder and single crystal X-ray diffraction using the WISH instrument at the ISIS spallation source in the UK. And we were able to establish through solving both the powder as well as the single crystal data, the actual magnetic structure that we think is the ground state of the vanadium third. So what we see is that we see two propagation vectors, one which is in plane component of the magnetism with the antiferromagnetically coupled layers of vanadium atom, which are ferromagnetically coupled to each other. And then another propagation vector, which is the out of plane up and down moments. And this is the resulting structure that we propose as a combination of these two, which is canting along the C-axis. Okay. This does not exhibit a chiral soliton lattice. Okay. So we are also studying some other helimagnets, which are layered, nickel iodide and iron 3 tin 2, both of which have been predicted to show exhibit skyrmions. But this is at a very early stage of investigation. So the last class of materials that I'd like to talk to you about are these frustrated magnets. And these are all intermetallic materials that have been very well studied, probably very well studied in the past, but have now been proposed as being of interest to the community working on skyrmions. Now, the first intermetallic material that was proposed as a skyrmion host was gadolinium-2 palladium silicon-3. And this is one of a family of very well-studied materials in the past. Here, what happens is that there is magnetic frustration, because this again is a space group where you've got the layered arrangement of atoms, and you've got this triangular lattice of the rare earths. So wherever there is a triangular lattice of the rare earths, invariably there's magnetic frustration in this. And sure enough, there is magnetic frustration, very strong magnetic frustration here. And this was proposed as one of the first materials where skyrmions are stabilized by magnetic frustration. Okay. Now the skyrmions in these materials is proposed to be only of the order of 2 to 3 nanometers. The ones that I showed you earlier, like the manganese silicide and the copper oxyselenate, the very well-studied examples I listed in the very beginning of the talk, there the skyrmion sizes are about 60 nanometers or 50 nanometers. So this is very, very small. But what's interesting is that the skyrmions are proposed as being stable over a very large region in the HT phase diagram. So it's about below about 20 Kelvin and in the field region marked here. So it's a very, very large area, not a tiny pocket like the ones that you saw earlier. Okay. So this was proposed, the existence of skyrmions on this was proposed using anomalous Hall effect measurements. And since studying the gadolinium, palladium, silicon crystals, we've been able to produce crystals of the entire family of these rare earths. And these crystals are produced by the floating zone technique, where we've modified our floating zone furnace to be able to produce crystals of these intermetallics. Now, once again, I'd like to emphasize that these are all very old materials. These have been very well studied. In fact, these papers in 1990 and 1999 actually map out most of the magnetic properties of these materials. For example, terbium, palladium, silicon shows about 8 states, which distinct magnetic states, very different to each other, all listed here, which exist below the Néel transition of 24 Kelvin, okay? And all of these are very similar. But it was proposed that maybe some of these could also be hosts for skyrmions, especially the holmium or the erbium. So that's being studied. So the crystal sizes that you can obtain of these intermetallics, they are very large compared to those crystals that I showed you earlier of those other skyrmion materials obtained by chemical vapor transport. And the very last one that I'd like to talk to you about is the gadolinium ruthenium 2 silicon 2. Now this again is a centrosymmetric structure where there is no magnetic frustration either. So it doesn't have the Dzieluzinski-Moria interaction, nor does it suffer from magnetic frustration, okay? So once again here, the observation of skyrmions or the skyrmions that are proposed to exist in this, it's not very clear what the mechanism is for the formation of the skyrmions in this. What is thought is that the skyrmions result due to the RKKY interaction in these. You can actually study the phase diagram for H parallel to the 001 and the H parallel to the 100, and the phase diagrams are very different. And this is the phase diagram that we've established at Warwick. And you see there are a lot of phases here that you can distinguish from AC susceptibility data. And by resonant X-ray scattering measurements, some authors have proposed what these different phases might be. And we have identified a further phase here, which is phase 4, which is still to be, the nature of this phase is still to be determined, okay? So there's a lot of intriguing things here that are worth studying, including this, the nature of the ground state here, the phase 1. Now, it's very crucial to understand what the ground state is. Just like in the TMDCs, you knew that the chiral soliton lattice evolved from a helical ground state. And it's the same in a lot of these skyrmion materials. You start off with a helical state and then go on to looking for these skyrmion pockets. So once again here, we've been able to grow large single crystals using the floating zone technique. And you can isolate crystals that are big enough for your measurements. And what we have done is that this forms the PhD project of one of my students, George Wood. And he's conducting a lot of measurements using X-ray scattering as well as neutron diffraction. You might wonder how neutron diffraction is possible with the gadolinium nuclei because gadolinium is very highly absorbing for neutrons. So what we have done is that we've robbed the bank to buy about 1 gram of this isotope here, 160 gadolinium isotope, which cost us about $12,500. And we've actually made a nice single crystal of this material suitable for neutron studies, single crystal neutron studies, which are all ongoing now. Okay. So I'll stop here and summarize for you what I've actually presented. So I've shown you single crystals of a variety of chiral and polar magnets. Some of them are frustrated magnets. And then I've also shown you examples where the skyrmion lattices are exhibited, and then some crystals where the chiral soliton lattice is seen as well. The possibility of observing skyrmion phases in layered and 2D materials is a very exciting prospect for many scientists. So there's a lot of excitement in that. And then there's always the search for skyrmions very close to room temperature, because ultimately I think it is seen as something that we could exploit for memory devices, just like the spintronics in other magnetic materials. And of course, there is also the search for new materials that continues. Okay. So the work that I've presented here has contributions from all of these people here. These are the scientists we worked with at the ISIS neutron and muon source. And for theory support, we've had help from Julie Staunton from Warwick and Juba Boaziz from Jülich, and also from the electron microscopy division of the university. And at the ILL in Grenoble, we've collaborated with Clemens Ritter. And there have been some experiments conducted at Diamond as well. And the entire skyrmion project team from all the other universities have also contributed to the work that I presented here. And of course, the funding comes from EPSRC, without which none of this would be possible. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll stop here.
Thank you, Geetha, for the talk. Questions?
You illustrated at the beginning with some images of skyrmions. Those skyrmions are all 1 pi skyrmions. That is, they turn from the edge to the center pi radians. Okay? Those that you find in experiments, do you identify them as 1 pi or n pi?
Okay,
skyrmions?
so all of them, whether they are nail skyrmions or block skyrmions, the 2 different types of skyrmions I showed you, they will have an n equals 1.
Okay.
So it's just that these other phases, so these other phases, what they call the Meron lattice, they will be n equals half.
Okay.
So
half a
both,
skyrmion, half a normal skyrmion.
yeah, half. Okay. So so both the nail skyrmion and the block skyrmion will have an n equals 1.
Yes. Well, I'm asking because, as you know, n equals 2 is the best kind of skyrmion, in the sense that it does not show Hall effect, skyrmion Hall effect. So you can move them in a
Electric field
with electric current density. Yeah. So they are nearer to experimental applications or industrial applications.
Yeah.
Okay,
so actually, imaging these skyrmions is rather complicated, and
yes.
So for the copper oxyselenate, it's been extensively imaged. For manganese silicide, there is a lot of literature in looking at these. But the nail skyrmions are very difficult to image using the Lorentz transmission microscopy, because because you need a magnetic moment, and you need they need to be responsive to a magnetic field.
Yeah.
And so with the small angle neutron scattering, there have been a lot of imaging done with the manganese silicide and the copper oxycelmane. But for all of these, this one for the gadolinium ruthenium silicon 2 and the gadolinium palladium silicon 3, this diagram is being drawn from the anomalous Hall effect by the Japanese group. Okay.
Okay.
So there's not a lot of imaging done on these materials yet at all.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Other question? What kind of adaptation have you done to the floating zone furnace for this intermetallic?
So we just have the ability to evacuate the chamber. So it's free of any oxygen. And apart from that, there's not a lot that we've done, okay? And you need to be able to achieve the temperatures at which these materials melt. So some of these materials melt at temperatures close to 2000. So you need to be able to achieve that temperature and also work in a completely oxygen-free atmosphere, okay? So you need to have it very, very airtight and be able to pump it down to a very high vacuum so that then you can backfill it with high purity argon and then work with the system.
Any more questions? If not, then let's thank you again.
Thank you.